It's the 19th of September 2002, and I'm Negley Harte, and I'm here with Giorgio Riello behind the camera in Basingbourn. Bassingbourn, terribly sorry, Bassingbourn, the village not far from Cambridge where Peter Mathias lives now in retirement. Peter Mathias was, of course, for many years a teacher of economic history in Cambridge, then professor of the subject in Oxford, and then master of Downing College, Cambridge. He's been president of the Economic History Society and of the International Economic History Association. His distinguished career in economic history spans the whole of the second half of the 20th century, spilling over a bit at the first end and a lot, we suppose, at the other end. But if we start at the beginning, or just before the beginning of the middle of the 20th century, Peter, you came up to Cambridge to read history. In what sense were you already an economic historian?
I don't think in any significant sense at all. I was quite interested in local history. I was quite interested in how the village in which I was brought up for most of the time, how that had evolved. I was very interested in my family history. I mean by that the immediate history of the family, particularly from my grandfather, who had 9 children, of whom my mother was one, and growing up in a small village near Trowbridge in Wiltshire. And that family story is interesting, and I still find it fascinating as a kind of microcosm of the changes in English society. But that was a purely personal, how can I put it, simply a sort of family observation from growing up there. I didn't originate there. I was in a sense evacuated in an informal way, because my father was in the Navy, in the Royal Navy. Then when he was retired from there in 1932, I think it was, one was not simply discharged but transferred to the Naval Reserve, and therefore he was called up again in 1938 rather than at the outbreak of war. And I was an only child, and we were living in Bristol, which is where he'd retired from Plymouth. And rather than my mother living alone, I had gone to a charity school, which was a residential school on the outskirts of Bristol. And rather than my mother living alone, she moved back to live with her parents, and I therefore went to this the same little cottage in the holidays from school. But all this was, in a sense, I think probably was valorized as an interest in social and economic history at the very local level, only when I became an undergraduate and began to see these things through a different perspective rather than at the time.
Right. When you went to Jesus, you must have fallen under the influence quite rapidly, am I right in supposing, of Charles Wilson?
Yes, indeed, and that was critical, a critical influence and a critical orientation.
Was he your tutor?
No, he wasn't my tutor. My tutor was a medieval church historian, political historian called Vivian Fisher. But Charles was director of studies in history, which in Cambridge is distinguished from being a tutor, which is having moral responsibility, or responsibility for one's moral failings, I suppose. But I came under the influence of Charles because Vivian Fisher taught me 1 or 2 papers in the first year, and Charles taught me a 3rd paper, which was English economic history from the beginning to the end, essentially, or beginning to the present.
Right. So it was, so to speak, under him that your interest in economic history was, and of course his business history interest must have been an important influence Two.
certainly.
Tell me what you thought of Charles Wilson when you first knew him.
There's one other dimension of Charles Wilson's interests that was quite important to me. He was bursar at the time of the college, and the college had quite a large agricultural estate, quite a lot of farms in Cambridgeshire and Lincolnshire, I think, too, as well as having a lot of property in Cambridge and a portfolio of financial assets. Supervision with Charles Wilson, because he was bursar, was rudely interrupted about every 5 minutes by people who were wanting to ask him questions as bursar. So I learned more about his interests in contemporary finance and property than I did, I think, probably of the mercantilism.
With straws in their mouth, or straws on their boots.
But I mean, he had a range of interests which tuned very much with my own as they evolved.
Now, a further influence at that time may have been Hrothgar Habakkuk, who in 1950 went from Cambridge to Oxford, but presumably in your first years as an undergraduate you went to his lectures?
I never saw him.
You never saw him?
Never saw him. We met and got to know one another only after he'd gone to Oxford. He was in the economics faculty rather than the history faculty, and that made quite a significant difference in those years.
That's a divide I might ask you about in a minute. But the professor of economic history was surely the unforgettable figure of Moody Apostle.
Indeed.
Now you must have gone to his lectures.
I did go to his lectures, but that was not quite straightforward because Charles had fallen out with Mounier at that particular time and tried to deter me from going to Mounier's lectures and said, "You don't want to be bothered with that." And so I had to attend his lectures in a sort of subterfuge. And eventually he found out, of course, and accosted me as to what on earth was the point of wasting our time going there. And I had to defend Mounier. It was unusual for a second-year undergraduate to be defending the professor of economic history at that time. But Charles drove me back from one defence to another, and finally, my last recourse was to say, "Well, you must admit that he's very good on the manner." And Charles Wilson's reply was, "He bloody well ought to have been. He was brought up on one."
But Boston must have been quite a powerful influence on you, in fact, then and through the 50s and 60s.
Yes, save that I only went to his, as an undergraduate, I only went to his lectures when I became a research student graduating in the summer of 1951. From that point on, of course, I met him more regularly, and he and Cynthia were singularly hospitable to graduate students, and so I met them on various levels of discussion at that point. But the other person who, as an undergraduate, was a very marked influence was a close colleague of Charles Wilson's, who was then senior tutor, and he later became master of Emmanuel College, Edward Wellborn.
Ah, yes.
Now, Wellborn had been a schoolboy, grew up at Market Raisin Grammar School in Market Raisin, where Charles had also been a schoolboy, and Wellborn was older than Charles and went to Emmanuel and stayed there for the rest of his life. And when Charles came up, guided by Wellborn, they maintained what became a close friendship, and I was passed on, so to speak, from Charles to Wellborn when I came up from my first year. And I was given strict instructions, unlike the Boston episode, to go to Wellborn's lectures without fail.
Right.
And this I did. I went to Wellborn's lectures all 3 years, and he never repeated himself for a sentence.
Wellborn is before my time, but
Yeah.
Wellborn, there are all sorts of stories about Wellborn.
Yeah.
Wasn't he rather an eccentric?
Totally. He was a wild man, and quite unpredictable. I mean, he was fanatically traditionalist in the ways of Cambridge, but was a wild radical when it came to talking about economic history and what he was interested in economic history and how he thought the dynamics of change worked. I mean, he was a very, very strange man. He was taken as a buffoon by the other people in the history faculty. He made everyone laugh, but there was a kind of logic behind his madness in that way, which very few people penetrated. But he was a very remarkable man, was Edward Wellborn.
Didn't write very much.
No, he wrote. Those were the days when you wrote something to get your fellowship rather than getting your fellowship in order to write something. He wrote a long essay on the Durham miners, which was in fact a fellowship dissertation. And I don't think that he wrote very much at all after that. He read voraciously, but there he was. It's too far away from this conversation, I think, to talk about what Wellborn actually believed.
Was he sort of clever and witty in the manner of, shall we say, perhaps Jack Fisher?
Yes, he was. He was greatly cynical. He had a kind of Johnsonian style to him. He had an enormous head like a horse, and was a large, shambling figure, Johnsonian in that way. And he carried unorthodoxy of view to limits that I had never known in someone holding a university and a college post. History, anyway.
Yeah. So, in the course of being an undergraduate, various strands came together, and you became a committed economic historian.
Yeah.
And
one other thing to be said about Wellborn, he was at that time and in that generation, both more particularly with the economics faculty, but also to some degree with the historians, he was an embattled figure of the right. I mean, he passionately crusaded against the soi-disant Marxist or left-wing orthodoxy, in particular of the Fabians, that were then totally dominant in English economic history. And he was quite ruthless, quite unscrupulous, quite outrageous in his denunciation of that tribe and all they stood for.
Well, it's a great pity that he lived before the days of the video camera.
Well, indeed, in many ways, of course, what was then a lone crusade in Cambridge had a wider vindication when things changed in the 50s and 60s.
There was another old eccentric around in Cambridge at that time, C.R. Fay.
Yes.
Did you come across C.R. Fay?
Again, not as an undergraduate, but as a graduate student. He lived in King's, and would appear as a very unsettling influence at Boston seminars. I started going to them in 1951 when I graduated. They were graduate seminars then, and Boston never knew how to handle Fay, who was not subject to any sort of discipline in the sense of what the director of a seminar might hope to achieve. I mean, he was again unpredictable and wild, and of course the things that he was concerned to talk about were not those which Poston wanted the seminar to discuss.
But unlike Wellborn, of course, he did publish quite a lot, and you can, in his writings, capture some of that lively eccentricity.
Yes, he could be said to have published too much and too long, because his last publications, although I have no doubt gratifying to the publisher, became really almost as unpredictable as he was in conversation.
There's quite a nice little book about the Great Exhibition.
Oh yes,
which must have been done for its centenary, I suppose, in 1951.
I was thinking one about Huskisson when he describes that he was in the National Liberal Club and fell asleep and had a dream, and he thought that Huskisson was waiting for him outside the Bank of England on his statue, and so Fay, although still in a dream, woke up, rushed down to Huskisson, saying, "It was a number 73 bus." He said, "Not a second time, Mr. Huskisson, not a second time, Mr. Huskisson." Well, you have to have great self-confidence to put that into print.
Now, you touched upon the divide in Cambridge between economics and history.
Yes.
Was that a divide that represented itself within economic history? Were there economic historians in the economics faculty, separate from the economic historians in the history faculty?
Yes, and apart from any personal links and friendship, there was no institutional liaison or coordination at all. Although the economists had one general paper in British economic history, which broadly coincided with a compulsory first year paper that I've mentioned in the history tripos, or the preliminary examination to the history tripos. Philistine and W.J. Macpherson lectured
to the economists.
And occasionally, when one was on leave, I would be asked to, if they could come to my lectures, because I was giving after 1955
lectures in the history faculty.
Yes.
Yeah, and that of course turned into your textbook, and Miss Dean's lectures to the economist turned into her.
Yes. I
was going to say rival textbook.
Yes. I was appointed an assistant lecturer in the summer of 1955, and was immediately given the task of the first year lecture course for British economic history, which Clapham had started, and Clapham did it from the beginning to the end. When Clapham died, then it was divided into two halves. John Saltmarsh of King's did the medieval, or up to the mid-17th century, and Charles Wilson did the second half. And as soon as I came on the scene, within microseconds, Charles had telephoned me to say that's what I had to do, so that he would be relieved of this terrible burden. It was Monday, Wednesday and Friday in the Mill Lane lecture rooms at 9 a.m.
Dear.
Not through the year, because John Saltmarsh did the first half, and I took over in the middle of the Lent term, or the beginning of the Lent term, to do the second half. But there was an anonymous sea of 300 faces in front of you in the Mill Lane lecture.
This course had to be taken by all people reading history
in the first year. Yes.
In the first year, this was a I was going to say unique feature, but at least a special feature of the Cambridge history degree
that
is
point,
included
yes.
Throughout the 20th century. Included a strong element of economic history.
Yes.
In contrast to perhaps Oxford.
I think so.
Yeah. Did this division between economic historians and economic historians extend institutionally further into ways of thought and friendships and so on?
I think that Munir Poston was very important in this respect. As professor, he was a member of the economics faculty as well as a member of the history faculty. He lectured on Marxism for the political science side of economics at that time, as well as lecturing on medieval economic history and on modern 20th century economic history for the historians. But he had close friendships with the economists, and therefore you met economists at his parties and they came to his seminars and so on. So that he, quite unlike Charles Wilson or any of the other economic historians in the history faculty, was a bridge between the economists and the historians, and that was very important.
Poston obviously had interest in, would you say, social science theory, because he was
Yes.
interested in economic theory, but also perhaps sociology,
Yes.
and of course his international connections. Whereas, did Charles Wilson not have any theoretical? Holland, of course, but not interested in continental theory, certainly not in Marxism.
Charles Wilson argued very much against the inclusion of sociology in the history tripos, and was against the intrusion, as he called it, of sociology into social sciences in Cambridge. I mean, he was very much against that sort of
Are you
incursion.
thinking now ahead to the 60s?
Yes.
When there was the battle about setting up sociology.
Yes.
Poston would have been on the other side.
I think so, yes. I think so. I can't remember in detail about that, but Charles was quite against the formal application or the formal use of theory, whether in economic theory or in social theory. He was very much an empiricist. I think he had a general awareness of these things. He was very shrewd and had a kind of instinctive sensitivity about issues and so on. But he would want to see. How can I put it? He would want to see any theoretical generalizations growing out of the empirical data, rather than seeing them as an independent source, then to be applied.
Yeah. And of course, he thought economic history was about how real livings were made
Yes.
in the real world.
Yes.
And this took him, of course, at this time in the early 50s, into business history.
Yes.
Because he was writing the history of Unilever,
Which
which
was
I take
published-
to be the first modern business history.
Of an industrial company. There have been histories of banks before then,
Yes.
with Clapham and Richard Sayers and the Bank of England and so on.
Yes.
And some of the commercial banks had asked professional economists to write their history, but this was the first history on a large scale of an industrial firm and a business in that sense.
Was it through Charles's interest in business history that your interest in business history arose?
Yes, essentially, in general and in specific terms. In general terms, Charles would talk in supervisions endlessly about Unilever, and when I graduated, I became his research student. And although my research topic was nothing to do with business history in the conventional sense and in the sense that he was concerned with business history, nevertheless, regular supervisions as a graduate student turned very often to business history that he was writing. The first two volumes of the history of Unilever were published in 1954. But then I was writing then and researching in the brewing industry, and that kept me more than occupied in research. But as soon as that was finished, and indeed before it was published, Charles persuaded me to take on the history of the retailing companies which had come together in the wake of the merger of the production companies in Unilever. Each of the main constituents or components of the merged Unilever had brought into the merger their own wagon train of retailing companies, because where they were involved in margarine, there was an imperative on control of the whole throughput from the margarine factories right down to getting it into the shops in a fresh state, which meant that you needed exact control, and the way to get that was to actually buy into the retailing companies. And then when the production companies came together, what was to happen with the independent and indeed competitive retailers that each brought in its wake? Well, they were all amalgamated into a multiple retailing group owned by Unilever, or Unilever had the controlling interest in it, which they called Allied Suppliers. And that was in one sense part of the Unilever story, but in another sense separate from it. And Charles did not want to continue with, to extend the history of Unilever to cover the retailing interests, and therefore he persuaded me to take it on, which I did.
I can quite see how you got into that. But how did you get into brewing?
There were various considerations, Wellborn being one of the most prominent. It happened that I had a second, possibly a third cousin, who was a brewer in a very small way of business in Rode, which is half a village, half a little town, just on the Somerset side of the border from Wiltshire, and a couple of miles from Wingfield, which is where I was living. They were our rich cousins, the only rich cousins that the family spotted. But we knew them vaguely, and I was always invited to a splendid Christmas party in the local hotel in the high street of Trowbridge, which were given by the Fussels, as they were called. So I had a link there, and that proved to be very important because the brewers were a highly conservative, highly reticent group. They had a good cause to know that almost everyone who wanted to know about their past was wanting to use it against them in sort of hostile temperance. Anne didn't take it.
I think Anne's
yeah. So it was difficult to get access at all. Well, my cousins wrote to the president or the chairman of the Brewers Society to say that I was a cousin, and that helped a great deal. And Wellborn knew Colonel Guy Dale, who ran Dale's Brewery and owned Dale's Brewery in Cambridge. And he took me up to the brewery, to Guy Dale, and we had a very bibulous lunch. And that did the trick also. But, I mean, academically, Wellborn persuaded me, it didn't need much persuasion, of the fact that the brewing industry was a critically important industry in the context of the 18th and 19th century, that no one had really touched it in research, in historical research, that it was, the ramifications of it were very wide, both in relation to history of agriculture,
Yes.
in question of public finance and excise and
Scale of production.
and all of that, and also
Strong consumption side.
in the very precocious structure of control of retailing, and that here was an industry which had cash sales in fixed points of retailing on a larger scale than anything else in the 17th and 18th century, so that it was a subject ripe for treatment, so to speak.
And presumably because of the way it was taxed, it was possible to quantify it more than many other industries
Yes.
could be quantified.
Yes.
So from the start there was all sorts of things going for it,
Yeah.
methodologically as well as in terms of sources.
Yes, and not only a question of output, because the excise regime ensured that the production was recorded and monitored, but also the number of common brewers, as they were called. They had to have licenses, and therefore one knew the changing number of common brewers, and you could therefore make some quantified estimates of the changing structure of the industry. And of course the pubs had to have licenses too, so that you could have some idea of what the changes on the retailing structure were.
Various quantitative ways into the...
Yes.
Yeah. Now, when you began working in the early 50s on brewing, this, partly the work itself, but what it took you out of Cambridge and made you aware of a wider world of economic history than just in Cambridge, I suppose.
Well,
and in particular, I fancy you fell under the influence of T.S. Ashton.
Certainly. Charles Wilson was aware that I had been, so to speak, never left home as an undergraduate. I mean by that I was Cambridge born and bred and inbred, doubtless. So he was anxious that I should go to T.S. Ashton's seminar, which I did from the moment I graduated. I was working in London most of the time anyway in that year, the first year and then the third year, because I was working essentially on the records of the London brewers that were found to be, plentiful beyond belief at that time. Charles was also anxious that I should go to the United States, but he forgot to submit my applications to all the relevant fellowships in the summer that I graduated, and they were only discovered in the sort of compost heap of his desk in mid-October after all the competitions had been held. So I went to the United States in my second year as a graduate student rather than in my first year, and probably in the long run that was advantageous.
But you went to Ashton Seminar your first year as a research student.
Yes.
What did you make of Ashton?
He was very kind to me, and no one could have been in seminars less assertive than Poston, say, in Poston's seminar. He was very quiet. He was smoking almost all the time, but then would ask the shrewdest of questions. I mean, he was a very reticent person, and that came out in the seminars. But he immediately asked me about my research and asked me to come early or to stay late after one or two of the seminars, and then, though I think he was a little, not shocked exactly, but he was a little surprised that I should have taken the brewing industry rather than textiles or iron and steel or something if I wanted to find out about the 18th century. But he was soon convinced, and it helped a had written a charming book on Peter Stubbs, who, as well as being a file maker in Warrington, was also a publican. So he had an entree, so to speak, into my interests.
Yeah. You must have got involved in the Economic History Society around this time. You became assistant editor of the review in 1955, but you must have already been a member. Did you go to early conferences?
I was indeed a member from the point of graduation. There's another point of departure or point of input here, which came from Teddy Rich, E.E. Rich.
Yes.
Who was, I can't remember, secretary or treasurer.
Yes.
Of the society.
He was secretary.
Yes.
1944 to 52.
Yes. Well, Teddy Rich came from my school. He'd been a pupil at Colston's Hospital in Bristol, and he had a brother who taught German in the school until he was called up in the early years of the war, called Ivor Rich. There were very few of my generation or previous generations, even fewer, at that school who went to a university at all. And I was almost the only one who'd come to Cambridge following Teddy Rich, who was of a quite different generation to myself. Well, Teddy Rich was very kind and would ask me to tea or whatever as an undergraduate. And then in 1951, Teddy Rich asked me, and I'm sure it was an illegal suggestion, he suggested that I might go to the Economic History Conference. I was still an undergraduate at the time, and therefore I think had not passed over from one world into the other. But Teddy Rich had a caravan, which he was to go off on family holidays, and in the Easter vacation he duly arranged to take this caravan with his wife, and I asked me if I would like to go over. But such was the state of my ignorance and naivete in this way. He said, "Oh well, the conference is in Worcester," and so we got into the car. And instead of driving through Oxford, we stopped in Oxford. I could not think why we'd stopped in Oxford.
So you found yourself at the famous conference at Worcester College where you froze. Everybody froze. It was very, very cold.
That's right. And T.S. Ashton was so frozen that he got out of bed, so he told us, and put the strip of carpet which was on the floor on top of his blanket to try and create a little more heat. Well, it was a memorable conference for me, needless to say. My eyes were agog because there were all these people who'd written books and so on, and I met Tony for the first time.
Michael Thompson has a marvellous story. Michael, of course, was the organiser, or at least Asa Briggs had set it up, but did Asa Briggs disappear or something?
I don't know, I can't
and
remember.
Michael Thompson was a research student, perhaps a year or two senior to you.
Yes, he was.
And he was the effective organiser, and Tony came down to breakfast wearing his blanket that he'd taken from the bed, and of course he started to set fire to it with that. And Michael spent the entire conference, he claims, worried about what the authorities of Worcester College would do, because the great Professor Tawney had burned holes in their blankets.
At these impressionable ages, you remember most things. I remember Tawney presiding over one of the sessions with his glasses on the top of his great domed head, and I think it was Jack Fisher. In the first row, a little bit of fire, he was smoking a pipe, a little bit of fire got into the matchbox and there was a phut, and the matches went up and a little pile of acrid smoke drifted out into the room. Tony, when it reached Tony, very carefully and slowly, deliberately put his glasses back onto his nose, held up a hand, stopped the person speaking in the paper, and said, "Is someone burning prematurely?" Masterful intervention. Anyway, that was a long time ago.
And so, so I hadn't realised that, Peter. You went as an undergraduate to that famous conference,
yes.
Which was, there was a previous conference in Birmingham.
Yes, I didn't know
the
that,
previous year, and I can't find anybody. Asa Briggs claims that he went, but can't say anything about it, and nobody else can remember anything about it. But Oxford was really the beginnings of the residential conferences that we've had every Easter since then. Was Rostow there?
I think so. Wait a minute. Rostow was visiting professor in 1950, I think, 51. He was lecturing in the economics faculty.
Yeah, in Cambridge.
In Cambridge at that time, and that which is where I met him for the first time, and I'm pretty sure that he was, although I wouldn't swear it in a court of law. But I mean, that was the beginning of Rostow's impact, and the impact was not on stages of economic growth. The impact was on his book on the British economy of the 19th century, which for the first time set out the evolution specifically in economic terms of cycles and trends and quantified rates of growth and so on.
Yes. And
that made a big impact. On me, and of course it was wholly alien to any kind of economic history that I had experienced in the history faculty in Cambridge.
Right.
And such being not the arrogance, but the impetuosity, if you like, of youth, I bought the book, and on his last lecture I went down to the rostrum and asked him if he'd signed it, and he did.
Oh!
So I got it downstairs somewhere.
Good.
Yeah.
Now, 1950. The great post-war, prolonged post-war boom in economic history had already begun. We can now see in retrospect. And certainly if you look at figures of either of publications or of members of the society, both of which, with Giorgio's help, I've counted, you can see this boom going from the late 40s all through the 50s, all through the 60s, and then the quantitative indicators showing that it changes quite dramatically in the mid-70s and begins what could be said to be a sort of decline, certainly when counted simply. Now, at what point in your career did you realise that you had, in fact, what's the right surfing term? You joined a breaker. I haven't got the right metaphor, but you know what I mean.
I think I became particularly conscious of it in 1955 when I became involved in with the society more particularly as assistant editor, and would meet Rothgar and Munir, and more particularly perhaps Ken Beryl, who was then treasurer, regularly. And one found out the shape of the curve, so to speak, there. But I mean, this was a trend of which there was no opposite or different trend in the past. All economic history had been very small, had been growing, and it was the rise and rise and rise of economic history at that in that phase. And of course, it was the financial implications for the society and for the Economic History Review were profound, because the more members there were, the greater the print run of the review. The greater the print run, the lower the unit costs. So it was a win-win situation, and the members benefited enormously, because one kept one kept the subscription at the lowest efficient level, and that was not accidental. A large number of the older members of the society were schoolmasters or were low-income professionals, as you might say. And Tony in particular was highly aware of the responsibilities, as he saw it, moral responsibilities of making the review and everything to do with the review with the society as low cost as possible, to enable maximum access. I well remember on one conference, I'm not sure which one it was, but Tony was still president, where the editors wanted to increase the subscription. They wanted to increase the size of the review or the number of issues per year or whatever. And they put this up at the council and the annual general meeting. Tony asked the treasurer what the state of the accounts were, whether the society was in surplus or not, and then asked whether the bank balance was positive or negative. And when assured that the society was prospering financially, he said, "The proposal is immoral," he said.
Yes, well, of course, the society is now in remarkably good financial position.
By virtue of the Blackwell contract, or what was the Blackwell contract?
Well, by virtue of a number of things.
Yeah.
Partly, you talked about Kenneth Beryl. He claims, I talked to him a few weeks ago, that the turning point came when he started to put the society's money into Japan and invested in Japan. But certainly under him, and your long 20-year period as treasurer of the society, surely it wasn't just the success of the sales of the review. There was a very astute financial management policy.
Well, Ken Beryl started that, of course, because he had then, from an academic base, great financial shrewdness and expertise, both as Bursar of St. Catherine's and secondly, subsequently as first Bursar of King's, and then went on to be an important figure in the city. And his shrewdness never left him financially, and the society gained enormously from that. It wasn't just Japan that he moved into. He moved into equities from the beginning, and one of his most important investments for the society was in a Dutch investment trust called Robeco, which went from strength to strength, and the society prospered enormously from that. Ken Beryl, as you will have known for a long time, is a very ebullient and bullish figure, but extremely shrewd and not at all a wild man when it comes to financial decisions. But he said in a light-hearted way, in the middle of this boom, before I took over, that he saw the society potentially as a kind of investment trust, where the members of the society would be the investors, that the review would be the kind of annual report of the investment trust, which could be, with any luck, distributed to members free in the future because of the surpluses which would be made on investment of the capital which was accumulating. And that,
but was it a trust that could go bankrupt? Was it a trust that could be taken over?
well, I mean, it was of course a jeu d'esprit, and it didn't reach the constitution of the society in any way. But it showed the kind of the width of the horizons that he brought to this.
One of the things that characterised this,
he did the same. It should be said, to the International Economic Association, where he was treasurer, and he transformed that. And one of the early post-war International Economic Association meetings was in Japan, and Ken Beryl went to Japan with most of the surplus of the International Economic Association in gold round his waist in a body belt. And by the time he got to Japan, having stopped off in the Philippines and other places, it was much larger than when he started. So,
I'm still thinking of this boom period,
yes.
Up to the late 70s. One of the things that characterised the expansion of economic history in Britain was the creation of separate departments of economic history. All the new chairs that spread out in the 50s and 60s generally meant a separate department. Now, in both Cambridge and Oxford, you were exempt from that sort of departmental constraint. Did you think that sort of thing was generally a good thing or generally a bad thing?
I accepted it for what it was, although conscious that in Cambridge there was this division between economic history in the economics department and economic history in the history faculty. So it wasn't without frontiers, but I thought that it was a good idea not to institutionalize the subject as a separate entity in universities, if only because it is such an eclectic subject anyway, that you put up artificial boundaries. And I was never in sympathy with the wails of despair and hostility when it came to departments of economic history, or sometimes they increasingly put in the word social as well. But anyway, when they were separate departments, I was never really impressed by letters seeking support to maintain the independence of the department, rather than the worst of all possible fates being merged usually with history. And I would write back to say, look, both in Oxford and in Cambridge, I survived very well in a university which had not compartmentalized and segregated economic history. And on the whole, I think that in retrospect now, most of those people in departments that were separate have accepted the fact that their horizons were broadened. Of course, this was associated with a fall in the number of undergraduates wanting to read the subject, which made it inevitable anyway for logistical reasons, quite apart from reasons of intellectual or academic advantage.
Now, were you expecting that, Peter? When in the mid-70s, if you look at the membership figures of the society, they reach a peak in 77, which is the year after we celebrated the Jubilee here in Cambridge. And every year since then, they have been falling. You just referred to, or implied, O-level and A-level figures, which we can count for economic history, begin to fall too in the 70s. And the fall in undergraduate demand begins in the 70s and becomes palpable in the 80s. Now, were you expecting that?
Not really. I mean, I was conscious that, as I said, two lectures, and also in the publication that you have there, I was conscious that the trends of the subject in quantification, and more particularly in
Yes.
the application of formal apparatuses of theory, that was in a direct sense making the subject very much more difficult for undergraduates to handle, more particularly if they were not in an economics faculty and having other papers in economics, but growing into the subject from the side of history rather than economics. That put a rising barrier to full access and awareness, and by being simply more difficult, the formal apparatus becoming more difficult, put a barrier to access, that was likely to choke off, so to speak, undergraduate demand for the subject. And that was a spontaneous intellectual or methodological evolution from within the subject by origin. It became clearly fashionable and led by American influence one way or another. I think also on the other side of the counter, so to speak, there were also changes. That's to say, within history, and what were meant by standard history courses also had begun to change to become very much more inclusive
Yes.
of economic and
Very
social
important
history.
point, yes.
So that there was a pull and a push
Yes.
effect. It seemed to me at that time.
There's a sort of irony that really the decline of economic history institutionally is really, to a large extent, because of its intellectual victory over history.
Yes.
Because there was no longer a sort of history that was anti-economic
Yes.
history or non-economic
As
history.
I've said, I think that in retrospect you can say that economic history lost the battle but won the war.
Yes.
And I think that is true. I mean, because considerations of economic influences and indeed social influences have invaded every other kind of specialism in history, whether it's military history, architectural history, medical history, whatever, or history of science, whatever you
Right.
mention, then
Right.
you can't write the history of science now without having a dimension
Right.
of the economic relevance.
So the way you would see economic history throughout the whole of your career has been its rise and rise, its ever greater success, despite these institutional blips, which can be explained in the way that you've just been touching on.
Yes, I also think that the way in which the methodology of the subject has evolved over the last 15 years has also been sympathetic to the reinterpretation, if you like, of what economic history is as an entity, where the relevance of non-quantifiable influences, for example, the breaking down by economists of economic variables as distinct from non-economic variables and non-quantifiable variables, and the way in which development economics has moved along that path. Again, the implications of that for economic history have been very favourable, it seemed to me. I tried to say something very briefly about that
Yeah.
in that retrospect.
Yes.
There.
Well, I think there's about 4 minutes left on the tape, so I'm going to ask, 3 minutes left on the tape, Giorgio tells me. I'm going to ask Giorgio if he wants to ask you a question.
Well, yes. I was thinking about, you told us about people who were influencing you. And
Yes.
May I ask you about your relationship with your students, especially graduate students?
Yes, I had a great many students, more particularly in Oxford, when if there was a student who was not an undergraduate pupil of a tutor, on the whole, the tutors didn't want to know, and therefore, the professor can supervise him or her. So I had a large number, I mean sometimes 17, 18, 19 at any one time in the 70s. That was when the subject was perhaps topping out, but numbers hadn't fallen at a graduate level. I was never, it's part in my nature and partly in the kind of intellectual or academic animal that I am, did not have a particular vision, a specific vision of economic history which I wish to impose upon others. And perhaps given the way in which subjects are structured in Oxford and Cambridge, it would have been much more difficult to do that in any event compared with a subject, a university or a context where the professor really runs the show and can be a professor more in a German sense than a British sense. So that that was not really in question. When I reached Oxford, Hugh Lloyd-Jones, who was Regius Professor of Greek and well known in Cambridge, said, "Always remember, Peter," he said, "tutors English good, professors German bad." But the professors were under strict control of by the tutors there, so that you didn't get the opportunity. However, some, such as, for example, Geoffrey Elton in Cambridge, did impose their stamp on their vision of a subject and on their discipline of graduate students. But I didn't do that.
Yes, Geoffrey was always very cross when students disagreed with him.
Yes, that's
and
right.
could have rows with them.
Yeah.
You never minded being disagreed with.
No, providing they were disagreeing with me on good evidence.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. Now, I think we've more or less covered what we. Is there something that you would have liked us to ask you about that we omitted to do?
I don't think so. I mean, we could have gone on
Obviously,
talking for
there's a
another
lot
hour.
more. There's a lot more.
And more
But we
particularly on the latter side of things, and also on the international association side of things.
I didn't ask about that, but of course you had quite a high profile internationally. There's so much else. We might do a second. Series in due course. I think that's more or less an hour. We're very grateful to you. Thank you.